March 1988. Oakland Coliseum, California. The Together Again tour was supposed to be the Rat Pack's triumphant reunion. Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, and Sammy Davis Jr. back on stage together after years apart. Every show was sold out. The press called it the tour of the century. But backstage that night, something happened that would shatter a 40-year friendship. Frank Sinatra, the man who'd been closer to Dean than his own brothers, said something. Dean Martin, who never let anything get under his skin, responded with words so cold they froze the room. Within hours, Dean walked off the tour. Quit. Just left. No explanation to the press. No farewell to the fans who'd paid hundreds of dollars for tickets. He flew home to Los Angeles and never looked back. Frank Sinatra, the man who'd called Dean every week for 40 years, never called him again. Not once. When they passed each other at industry events, they'd nod politely like strangers. When Dean's son died the year before, Frank had flown across the country to be there. But after that night in Oakland, nothing but silence. What could possibly destroy a friendship that deep? What words could break a bond that had survived everything life threw at it? The answer reveals a truth about grief, loyalty, and the invisible lines that once crossed can never be uncrossed. Before we reveal what happened that night in Oakland, hit that like button and subscribe. This is a true story about friendship, loss, and the moment two legends stopped being brothers. Comment if you remember the Rat Pack. ***, the friendship that defined an era. To understand what happened in Oakland, you need to understand what Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin meant to each other. They weren't just friends or collaborators. They were brothers in every way that mattered. It started in the late 1950s. Frank was already a superstar, recovering from his career slump and comeback. Dean had recently split from Jerry Lewis and was trying to prove he could succeed as a solo act. They met at a party in Hollywood, and something clicked immediately. It was like finding the other half of yourself, Frank later told his daughter Nancy. Dean understood me in ways nobody else did. We came from the same world, Italian families, working-class backgrounds, knowing what it meant to fight for everything you got. They became inseparable. Performed together, vacationed together, raised their kids alongside each other. When Frank formed the Rat Pack, Dean was always by his side. Not as a sidekick, Dean was never anyone's sidekick, but as an equal. The cool to Frank's fire. The easy laugh to Frank's intensity. For nearly 30 years they spoke almost every day. Frank would call Dean just to talk. About nothing important, sports, music, family, whatever was on their minds. Dean's wife Jean said, "Some mornings I'd wake up and Frank would already be on the phone with Dean. I don't know what time Frank called, but Dean always answered." They protected each other. When the press criticized Frank, Dean defended him. When mob rumors swirled around both of them, they presented a united front. When personal tragedies struck, Frank's mother dying in a plane crash, Dean's divorce from Jean, they were there for each other without hesitation. Dean was the only person who could tell Frank the truth, recalled Sammy Davis Jr. If Frank was being unreasonable or difficult, Dean could say, "Hey Dag, you're being an idiot," and Frank would actually listen. Anyone else would get yelled at or cut off. But Dean? Frank respected him too much. The respect went both ways. Dean, who had a reputation for not caring about much, cared deeply about Frank's opinion. When Dean was considering a new movie role or recording project, he'd ask Frank what he thought. Not for approval, but for honest feedback from someone whose judgment he trusted. The loss that changed everything. Then came March 21, 1987. Dean Martin's son, Dean Paul Martin, was flying an F-4 Phantom jet for the California Air National Guard. During a training mission, his plane crashed into Mount San Gorgonio. Dean Paul was 35 years old. He left behind a wife and a young son. The news destroyed Dean. His eldest son, his namesake, the child he'd been closest to, gone in an instant. Friends said Dean aged 10 years overnight. The light went out of his eyes. The easy smile disappeared. Frank Sinatra was one of the first people to reach Dean after the news broke. He flew immediately to Los Angeles, went straight to Dean's house, and sat with his friend through that first terrible night. Frank didn't try to make it better, Dean's daughter Deanna later wrote. He didn't offer platitudes or tell Dad it would be okay. He just sat there. Sometimes they'd talk. Sometimes they'd just sit in silence. Frank knew there was nothing he could say, so he just made sure Dad wasn't alone. For weeks after, Frank called Dean multiple times a day, checking in, offering support, trying to help his friend through the darkest period of his life. But nothing worked. Dean was drowning in grief, and no one could pull him out. Dean stopped performing, stopped recording, stopped doing much of anything. He'd sit in his house watching old videos of Dean Paul drinking morning. His family was worried. His manager was worried. Everyone was worried. Except Frank wasn't just worried. Frank was convinced he knew what Dean needed. The tour proposal. In late 1987, Frank Sinatra came up with an idea. A reunion tour. Him, Dean, and Sammy Davis Jr. the Rat Pack together again. It would be huge. Sell out arenas. Make headlines. And most importantly, in Frank's mind, it would give Dean a reason to get out of his house and back into life. Dean needs this, Frank told the tour promoters. He needs to remember who he is. He's Dean Martin, for God's sake. He's not meant to sit in a dark house mourning. He's meant to be on stage making people happy. Frank's intentions were good. He genuinely believed that performing would help Dean heal. That being back on stage with his oldest friends would remind Dean that life was still worth living. But Frank didn't ask Dean what he needed. He decided for him. When Frank first proposed the tour, Dean said no. Firmly. I'm not ready, Dag. I don't have it in me anymore. You don't have to be ready, Frank argued. You just have to show up. We'll handle the rest. The fans love you. Sammy and I will be there. We'll make it fun like the old days. The old days are gone, Dean said quietly. Everything's different now. But Frank wouldn't accept no for an answer. He kept pushing. Called Dean every day. Sent mutual friends to convince him. Even got Dean's ex-wife Jean involved, asking her to talk to Dean about doing the tour. Finally, Dean agreed. Not because he wanted to, but because Frank wouldn't stop pushing. Because he was tired of fighting. Because maybe, just maybe, Frank was right and performing would help. I'll do a few shows, Dean told Frank. But I'm not promising anything. If I can't handle it, I'm out. You won't need to quit, Frank assured him. You're going to love it. Trust me, Paul. That trust, 40 years of trust, of friendship, of brotherhood, was about to be tested in ways neither man anticipated. The warning signs. The Together Again tour, launched in March 1988. From the very first show, it was clear that Dean wasn't himself. He'd always been the most laid-back member of the Rat Pack, making everything look effortless. But now he just looked tired. Lost. He'd forget lyrics to songs he'd sung 1,000 times. He'd miss cues during comedy bits. During the famous Rat Pack banter where they'd riff and joke with each other, Dean would just stand there, barely participating. The audiences didn't seem to mind. They were just happy to see the legends together. But backstage, the tension was building. Frank was frustrated. This wasn't the Dean he knew. This wasn't the performer who'd made it all look easy for 40 years. Snap out of it, Frank would tell Dean between shows. The audience deserves better than this. We deserve better than this. Dean would just nod and say nothing. What could he say? That every moment on stage felt like torture? That he'd rather be anywhere else? That the grief was eating him alive and performing for strangers was the last thing he wanted to do? Sammy Davis Jr. tried to be the mediator. Frank, ease up on him. He's doing the best he can. His best isn't good enough, Frank shot back. Not for this. People are paying good money to see the Rat Pack, not to watch Dean Martin sleepwalk through a show. After 2 weeks and 5 shows, Dean had had enough. The breaking point came in Oakland, California. It wasn't the worst show, they'd all been rough, but something about that night pushed Dean past his limit. The setup for disaster. The Oakland Coliseum was packed. 15,000 people filled the arena. The show followed the usual format. Frank and Dean and Sammy would each sing solo numbers. Then they'd do comedy bits together, trading jokes and insults like the old days. But Dean's heart wasn't in it. During his solo performance, he sang, "Everybody Loves Somebody," like he was reading a phone book. No emotion, no connection, just going through the motions. Frank watched from the wings, his jaw tight. After Dean's set, they had a scheduled break before the big finale. Frank went to Dean's dressing room. "Dean, we need to talk." "Not now, Dag. I'm tired." You're always tired, Frank snapped. When are you going to start giving a damn about this tour? About the people who paid to see you? About Sammy and me? Dean looked at Frank with empty eyes. I never wanted to do this tour, Frank. You pushed me into it. You convinced me. You promised it would help. Well, guess what? It's not helping. It's making everything worse. Because you won't even try. Frank's voice was rising now. You stand up there like a corpse. The Dean Martin I knew would never phone it in like this. He had pride. He had professionalism. The Dean Martin you knew died with his son, Dean said quietly. That's when Frank made his mistake. The words that couldn't be taken back. Frank Sinatra, frustrated and angry, said the words that would end their friendship. Dean Paul wouldn't want to see you like this. He'd be ashamed of what you've become. The dressing room went completely silent. Dean stood up slowly, his face drained of color. What did you just say? His voice was barely a whisper. Frank realized immediately that he'd gone too far. Dean, I didn't mean. Yes, you did. Dean's voice was cold now. You meant every word. You think you know what my son would want? You think you have the right to tell me how to grieve for my boy? I'm trying to help you, Frank said, but his voice had lost its conviction. You're drowning and I'm trying to save you. By using my dead son against me? Dean's hands were shaking. By telling me he'd be ashamed of his father? The door opened and Sammy Davis Jr. walked in, sensing something was wrong. What's going on? Dean didn't take his eyes off Frank. I'll tell you what's going on, Sammy. Frank here has decided that he knows better than me how I should feel about losing Dean Paul. He's decided that my grief isn't convenient for his tour, so I need to just get over it. That's not what I said, Frank protested. That's exactly what you said. Dean's voice was getting louder now, and people in the hallway were starting to notice. You used my son, my dead son, to try to guilt me into performing better. That's what you did, Frank. Sammy stepped between them. Guys, come on. We've got a show to finish. There is no show, Dean interrupted. I'm done. I'm going home. You can't leave in the middle of a tour, Frank said. We have commitments. Contracts. Dean laughed, but it was bitter. Watch me. You want to sue me? Go ahead. Take everything I have. I don't care anymore. My son is dead, Frank. Nothing else matters. The escalation. Frank's pride wouldn't let him back down. Even though he knew he was wrong, even though he could see the pain in Dean's eyes, he doubled down. Fine, Frank said coldly. Walk away. That's what you do, isn't it? When things get tough, Dean Martin walks away. You walked away from Jerry Lewis. You walked away from your marriages. Now you're walking away from this. Dean stared at Frank like he'd never seen him before. I walked away from Jerry because it was time. I walked away from marriages that weren't working. But this is different. You're comparing those things to me refusing to let you exploit my grief for ticket sales. That's not fair, Frank said. This tour wasn't about money, wasn't it? Dean challenged. Then why did you push so hard? Why couldn't you accept that I wasn't ready? Why did you keep calling, keep pressuring, keep insisting that you knew what was best for me? The truth was hanging in the air between them. Frank had wanted the tour partly to help Dean, yes, but also because Frank Sinatra needed it. Needed to prove the Rat Pack still mattered. Needed to feel relevant. Needed to be on stage doing what he did best. You used me, Dean said, the realization hitting him. You used my grief and our friendship to get what you wanted. And when I couldn't deliver what you needed, you blamed me. You blamed my dead son. Dean, Frank reached out, but Dean stepped back. Don't touch me. We're done, Frank. 40 years and it ends here. Because you crossed the line that can never be uncrossed. The point of no return. Sammy Davis Jr. was crying now. Guys, please. Don't do this. We're family. Family doesn't do what he just did, Dean said, pointing at Frank. Family doesn't weaponize the worst thing that ever happened to you. Frank's face was red. I was trying to motivate you. By telling me my son would be ashamed of me? Dean's voice cracked. You know what, Frank? Maybe you're right. Maybe Dean Paul would be ashamed, but not of me grieving. He'd be ashamed that I let you talk me into this tour when every cell in my body was screaming to stay home. He'd be ashamed that I valued your opinion more than my own instincts. Dean started packing his belongings. Stage clothes, personal items, everything he'd brought for the tour. His hands were shaking, but his movements were purposeful. What about the rest of the shows? Frank asked. What am I supposed to tell people? Dean turned to face him one last time. Tell them the truth, Frank. Tell them that Dean Martin's son died. And his best friend decided that wasn't a good enough excuse to phone in a performance. Tell them that friendship means nothing when it conflicts with show business. That's not true, Frank said, but his voice was weak. Isn't it? You've been mad at me for 2 weeks because my grief is inconvenient for you. Because I'm not the Dean Martin you want me to be right now. Well, I'm sorry, Frank. I'm sorry I'm not entertaining enough while I'm mourning my son. The sarcasm in Dean's voice was like acid. This wasn't the easygoing Dean that everyone knew. This was a man who'd been pushed past his breaking point by the one person who should have protected him. The walkaway. Dean picked up his bag and headed for the door. Sammy grabbed his arm. Dean, please. Sleep on it. Things will look different in the morning. Dean gently removed Sammy's hand. No, Sammy, they won't. Some things can't be fixed with time. Some words can't be taken back. He looked at Frank one more time. You know what hurts the most? I trusted you. When Dean Paul died, you were the first person I wanted to see. You sat with me that night and I thought, thank God I have Frank. But you weren't there for me. You were there because it's what friends do. And the second it became inconvenient, the second my grief interfered with your plans, you turned on me. I didn't turn on you, Frank said, but there was no conviction in his words anymore. Yes, you did. The Frank Sinatra I knew, the one I loved like a brother, would never have used my son's death against me. So either you've changed or I never really knew you at all. Either way, we're done. Dean walked out of the dressing room, out of the arena, into a waiting car that took him to the airport. By midnight, he was back in Los Angeles. He'd flown home without saying goodbye to anyone except Sammy, who'd followed him to the car and hugged him one last time. I understand, Sammy told him. I don't agree, but I understand. Take care of yourself, Sammy, Dean replied. And take care of Frank. He's going to need it. Those were the last words Dean Martin ever spoke about Frank Sinatra to anyone in the Rat Pack circle. The immediate aftermath. Back at the arena, Frank had to go on stage and explain to 15,000 people that Dean had left the tour. He kept it brief. Ladies and gentlemen, I have to apologize. Dean Martin has had to leave the tour due to personal reasons. Sammy and I will do our best to give you a great show anyway. The audience was confused and disappointed. Many demanded refunds. The press had a field day. Rat Pack falls apart, the headlines screamed. Dean Martin walks out on Sinatra. Frank finished the tour with just Sammy and guest performers filling Dean's spot. But it wasn't the same. The chemistry was gone. The magic was missing. It was just two old performers going through routines, pretending everything was fine when everyone knew it wasn't. The silence that followed. After Oakland, the silence between Frank and Dean was deafening. For 40 years they talked constantly. Now nothing. Frank's phone calls to Dean went unanswered. Letters were returned unopened. Messages passed through mutual friends got no response. Frank's pride wouldn't let him apologize. Not properly. He told people, Dean's being unreasonable. He quit in the middle of a tour. That's unprofessional. But the people close to Frank knew the truth. His daughter Nancy later wrote, Dad knew he'd messed up. He'd said something unforgivable, and he knew it. But apologizing meant admitting he was wrong. And Dad had spent his whole life never admitting when he was wrong. Dean, meanwhile, returned to his solitude. He told his daughter Deanna, Frank wasn't wrong about Dean Paul being ashamed, but he'd be ashamed of both of us. Me for letting Frank push me into something I wasn't ready for, and Frank for using grief as a weapon. The entertainment industry watched in shock as two of the closest friends in Hollywood became strangers. At parties and events, they'd occasionally end up in the same room. They'd acknowledge each other with a nod, maybe a brief hello if others were watching. But there was no warmth, no connection. Just two men going through the motions of civility. It was heartbreaking to watch, recalled comedian Don Rickles, who was friends with both men. These two guys who'd been inseparable, who'd loved each other like brothers, now couldn't stand to be in the same room. and neither one would take the step to fix it. The missed opportunities. Over the next few years, there were several moments when reconciliation seemed possible, times when pride might have been set aside, when the years of friendship might have outweighed one terrible night. In 1990, Sammy Davis Jr. was diagnosed with throat cancer. Both Frank and Dean came to visit him at the hospital, on different days. Sammy begged them to make peace. "Life's too short, guys," Sammy told each of them separately. "I'm dying, and watching you two not speaking is killing me faster than this cancer." Frank promised to reach out to Dean. Dean promised to take Frank's call if it came. But Frank never called and Dean never picked up the phone either. Both waited for the other to make the first move. Sammy died in May 1990. At the funeral, Frank and Dean stood on opposite sides of the room. People noticed. The press noticed. Even Sammy's death couldn't reunite them, one columnist wrote. After the service, they were walking to their cars, which happened to be parked near each other. They ended up face to face on the sidewalk. Neither spoke for a long moment. Finally, Dean said, "He loved you, you know. Sammy. He loved you until the end." "He loved you too," Frank replied. They stood there, two old men who'd lost their best friend, who'd lost each other. Both wanting to say more. Both unable to find the words. Dean nodded once and got in his car. Frank watched him drive away. According to Frank's driver, Frank sat in his car for 20 minutes afterward, just staring straight ahead. But still no phone call came. The final years. Dean Martin essentially retired after the Oakland incident. He made a few public appearances but mostly stayed home. His health declined. The smoking, the drinking, the grief, it all took its toll. Frank continued performing, but those close to him said he was never quite the same. He'd sometimes talk about Dean in interviews but always carefully, never acknowledging the fight, never explaining what really happened. "Dean Martin was one of the greatest talents I ever worked with," Frank would say. "We had some wonderful years together." Past tense. Like their friendship was just a chapter in a history book. Friends tried to intervene. Frank's daughter Nancy called Dean several times. "Dad's too proud to apologize, but he misses you. Can't you just call him?" Dean's response was always the same. "Nancy, I love your father. But what he said can't be unsaid. Some lines, once you cross them, you can't come back from." In 1993, Dean Martin made his last public appearance at a tribute dinner. Frank Sinatra was scheduled to be there. Dean's family hoped this would be the moment of reconciliation. But when Dean arrived and saw Frank across the room, he turned to his daughter and said, "I can't do this." He left before the dinner even started. Frank, when told that Dean had left because of him, just nodded. "I understand," he said quietly. "I destroyed something precious, and I don't know how to fix it." The regret. In his final years, Frank Sinatra privately expressed deep regret about what happened. According to his close friends and family, he'd replay that night in Oakland in his mind, wishing he could take back those words about Dean Paul. "The worst thing I ever did," Frank told his friend comedian Tom Dreesen, "was use a man's grief against him. Dean trusted me with his pain and I weaponized it. I don't blame him for never forgiving me." But Frank never picked up the phone to tell Dean this. Never wrote a letter. Never sent a message through friends. His regret remained private, locked inside, along with all the things he wished he'd said differently. Dean, for his part, never spoke publicly about the fight. When asked about Frank in interviews, he'd say, "Frank and I had our time together. It was good while it lasted. That's all." But privately, according to his children, Dean would sometimes watch old Rat Pack footage. Frank and Dean on stage, laughing together, finishing each other's sentences, being brothers. He'd watch with tears in his eyes, mourning not just his son, but the friendship that died with their fight. "Dad never stopped loving Frank," Deanna Martin wrote years later. "But love alone isn't enough when trust is broken. Dad couldn't be around Frank anymore without remembering the worst night of his life. Not just because of what Frank said, but because Frank, his closest friend, chose that moment to hurt him instead of help him." The end. Dean Martin died on Christmas Day, 1995. He was 78 years old. His health had been declining for years, and he'd essentially given up on life after Dean Paul's death. Frank Sinatra was told about Dean's passing within hours. According to Nancy Sinatra, her father locked himself in his room for the rest of the day. When he finally came out, his eyes were red from crying. "I waited too long," Frank said. "I thought we'd have more time. I thought one day I'd pick up the phone and say what needed to be said. Now it's too late." Frank attended Dean's funeral but sat in the back. He didn't speak during the service, didn't approach the family, just sat alone with his regrets and his grief. After everyone else had left, Frank stood by Dean's casket for a long time. What he said, if anything, nobody knows. But his driver reported that Frank seemed to age years in those few minutes. The weight of what he'd lost, not just Dean but the friendship, the brotherhood, the decades of shared history, seemed to crash down on him all at once. Frank Sinatra lived another 2.5 years after Dean's death. He never spoke publicly about their falling out, never explained what happened in Oakland. But friends said he was haunted by it. "Dad carried that guilt with him to his grave," Nancy Sinatra wrote. "He knew he'd destroyed something precious. He knew he'd said something unforgivable. And he knew he'd been too proud to fix it when he had the chance." The lesson about words. The story of Frank and Dean's falling out teaches us something profound about the power of words. Words once spoken can never be truly taken back. You can apologize. You can explain. You can regret. But you can't make someone unhear what you said. Frank used Dean's deepest pain, the loss of his son, as a weapon in an argument. That betrayal, that violation of trust, broke something that couldn't be repaired. Not because Dean was unforgiving, but because some betrayals cut too deep. In our own lives, we need to remember this. When we're angry or frustrated with someone we love, we need to think before we speak. Because the words we use in anger can destroy relationships that took decades to build. How many friendships, marriages, family bonds have been destroyed because someone said something cruel in a moment of frustration? How many people carry regrets about words they wish they could take back? Frank Sinatra had everything. Fame, wealth, talent, the love of millions. But none of it could undo the damage of one terrible sentence spoken in anger to the person who trusted him most. The lesson about grief. The other crucial lesson is about grief and how we respond to others' pain. Frank thought he was helping Dean by pushing him to perform, by trying to get him back to normal. But grief doesn't work that way. Dean needed time. He needed space. He needed people to accept that he was broken and might stay broken for a while. What he didn't need was someone telling him how to grieve, or using his son's memory to manipulate him. This is a lesson we all need to learn. When someone we love is grieving, our job isn't to fix them or rush them through it. Our job is to sit with them in their pain, to accept them as they are, to support without judgment. Frank's mistake wasn't just what he said. It was thinking he knew better than Dean what Dean needed. That arrogance, that certainty that he was right, led him to cross a line he could never uncross. The lesson about pride. Perhaps the saddest part of this story is that reconciliation was possible. 4 years after Oakland, both men wanted to fix things. Both regretted what happened. Both missed their friendship desperately. But neither would take the first step. Pride prevented Frank from properly apologizing. Pride prevented Dean from accepting anything less than a full apology. And pride ultimately destroyed what anger had only wounded. How many relationships die this way? Not because the offense was unforgivable, but because both sides are waiting for the other to make the first move. Because admitting wrong feels like losing? Frank and Dean wasted 7 years, the final 7 years of their lives, being strangers to each other. All because neither could set aside their pride long enough to say, "I'm sorry. I miss you." Our friendship matters more than being right. The lesson about timing. There's another painful truth in this story. The illusion that we'll always have more time. Frank thought he'd eventually call Dean. Dean thought maybe one day he'd be ready to hear from Frank. Both assumed they'd have years to work it out. They were wrong. Life is short and unpredictable. The people we love won't always be here. If something needs to be said, an apology, an expression of love, a healing conversation, it needs to be said now. Not tomorrow. Not next month. Not when we're ready. Now. Frank learned this lesson too late. He stood by Dean's casket, finally understanding that later had become never. All the things he'd meant to say, all the apologies he'd planned to make, all the healing conversations he'd imagined, none of them would happen. We can't let this be our story too. If there's someone you need to call them today. If there's an apology you need to make it now. If there's a relationship that needs healing, start the healing process before it's too late. The legacy. In the years since both men passed away, the story of their falling out has become a cautionary tale in Hollywood. It's used as an example of how even the strongest friendships can be destroyed by a moment of cruelty and a lifetime of pride. But it's also a reminder of what they had before that night. 40 years of brotherhood. 40 years of laughter, support, and genuine love. 40 years of friendship that defined an era of entertainment. That friendship gave the world some of its most memorable performances, its most joyful moments, its most perfect example of what true camaraderie looks like. The Rat Pack wasn't just about talent. It was about the genuine affection those men had for each other. Oakland didn't erase those 40 years. They couldn't. The friendship was real, the bond was deep, and nothing can take away what they meant to each other during those decades. But Oakland did prove that even the strongest bonds can break. That there are lines that once crossed change everything. That words matter, timing matters, and pride can be the most destructive force in human relationships. The final truth. Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin loved each other. That love survived everything: career pressures, personal problems, public scrutiny, the crazy demands of fame. It survived for 40 years, which is longer than most friendships last. What it couldn't survive was one friend weaponizing the other's grief, and neither friend being humble enough to fix what was broken before it was too late. This is the tragedy at the heart of their story. Not that they fought, all friends fight. Not even that the fight was terrible, terrible fights can be forgiven. The tragedy is that they had years to fix it and chose not to. They had countless opportunities to set aside pride and rebuild their friendship, but they let those opportunities pass. And then suddenly there were no more opportunities. Just regrets and silence and the ghost of a friendship that had been, in its time, one of the most beautiful things either man had ever known. If this story moved you, if it made you think about relationships in your own life that need healing, hit that subscribe button right now. Share this video with someone you've been meaning to call. Comment below. Is there someone you need to reach out to before it's too late? Remember, words have power. Use them carefully, especially with the people you love most. Grief deserves compassion, not criticism. Pride is the enemy of healing. And tomorrow is never guaranteed. If something needs to be said, say it today. Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin gave the world decades of joy. But their final chapter reminds us that even the strongest friendships require care, humility, and the willingness to say I'm sorry when we're wrong. Don't let pride steal years from your relationships. Don't let important words go unspoken. Don't wait for the perfect moment to heal what's broken. That moment might never come. Pick up the phone. Send the message. Have the conversation. Before it's too late. Rest in peace, Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin. Your friendship, even with its tragic ending, still teaches us about love, loss, and the precious nature of the bonds we build with others. May we learn from your mistakes and honor the beautiful brotherhood you shared for 40 years.